Ever feel like you're drowning in information? Like, seriously, there's just too much coming at you all the time.
It's the way of the world now, right?
Totally.
Right.
And today, we're diving deep into how the pros handle it, intelligence analysts.
Oh, interesting.
We're cracking open this document called Psychology of Intelligence Analysis.pdf. It's a fascinating look at how they make sense of chaos.
I bet. Especially when the information they're working with can be, well, uncertain at best.
Absolutely. And
Right.
sometimes totally contradictory. So we'll unpack the mental tools these analysts use, which honestly are super relevant to all of us.
When people hear intelligence analysis, they think spies and top secret stuff.
Right.
But really, it's about how we all process information to make decisions.
That's so true. This deep dive is going to give everyone a serious upgrade to those decision-making skills no matter what you do.
I'm all for that.
And one thing the document stresses is that more information isn't always the answer. It's about quality over quantity.
Oh, for sure. Having the right mental models, the right tools to actually make sense of what you already know, that's key.
It's like that saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. Sometimes we get so bogged down in the details we miss the bigger picture.
It's so easy to do. And that's where experience comes in.
Oh, definitely.
Think about a chess master. It's not about memorizing every possible move. It's about recognizing patterns. And expert analysts, they have those same pattern recognition skills. Mental schemas built over years and years of looking at complex situations.
So our brains are kind of like giant webs of interconnected ideas, and those connections influence how we interpret everything.
That's it. That makes me think about another crucial aspect, memory itself. We store and retrieve information in a way that's, well, it's not like downloading facts into a computer.
It's way more nuanced than that, right?
Exactly. It's more like weaving a tapestry, connecting new information to what we already know, which, as you can imagine, isn't always a perfect process.
And that's where those pesky biases can creep in, right? We tend to see what we expect to see, even if it's not really there.
You hit the nail on the head. Our brains are wired to find patterns, trying to create order out of chaos. And that helps us navigate this crazy, complex world. But it also means we can get stuck, clinging to assumptions that might be leading us astray.
So how do we break free? How do we challenge those deeply ingrained assumptions, those mental shortcuts that can trip us up?
It takes effort, that's for sure.
Ooh.
But the document highlights a powerful concept, sensitivity analysis.
Okay, I like where this is going.
It's about actively questioning those linchpin assumptions. Ask yourself, what would have to happen to change my mind about this? If you can't think of anything, that's a bit of a red flag.
That's a really great point. It's so easy to get stuck in our own heads.
Yeah.
This document is really encouraging us to get outside those comfort zones and consider other possibilities.
Right. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses and seeing the world in a whole new light. And that leads to another crucial insight, the power of using a variety of analytical strategies.
Oh, I like that. Like having different tools in your analytical toolbox.
Precisely. The document focuses on three main approaches: applying theory, using situational logic, and making comparisons.
So it's about looking at a problem from multiple angles, each approach revealing something new.
That's it. Each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses, of course. It's like, take historical analogies. They can be amazing for connecting the dots across time, but
You can get stuck in the past, right?
exactly. Blind to new realities if you're not careful. Real analytical mastery, it's not just about gathering information. It's about that critical thinking piece, synthesizing different viewpoints, and always questioning your own assumptions.
Always be questioning. I love it. Now, this next concept, I think, might be the biggest takeaway from this whole document: the power of competing hypotheses.
Oh, that's a big one. It's a total game changer.
It sounds so simple, but I'm guessing it's not quite that easy.
It's easy to get stuck on that one explanation that seems most likely, right? But with this approach, you're pushing yourself to generate multiple hypotheses. And then this is key. You try to disprove them.
Instead of just looking for information that supports what you already think, it's like turning the whole process upside down.
It is. It's a mental workout, for sure. But the document gives us a really practical step-by-step procedure to do it, even with limited information.
So we can all use this, not just, CIA analysts.
Exactly. It's a tool for anyone who wants to make more objective, well-informed decisions.
And speaking of how our brains work, we can't forget about those cognitive biases that can really trip us up. Have you ever noticed how you're more likely to think something's going to happen just because you can easily picture it?
Oh, all the time. or because something similar just happened recently. It's like our brains are playing tricks on us.
They totally are. That's the availability bias at work. It's not even about logic. It's pure emotion and personal experience driving the bus.
And then there's anchoring bias, getting stuck on that first piece of information you hear, even if it's wrong. Or confirmation bias, where we just see what we want to see. These biases, they're sneaky. Even when we know about them, we still fall into the traps.
It's true. Our brains are wired to take shortcuts, and sometimes those shortcuts lead to dead ends. It makes you realize how important it is to have these structured approaches, like the analysis of competing hypotheses, to help us overcome those mental pitfalls.
It's like having those guardrails on a winding road. They
Yeah,
keep you on track, prevent you from veering off course.
I like that analogy. Okay, so we've talked about how our brains process information, the role of memory, and those sneaky biases that can creep in. But what happens when we need to make judgments based on incomplete information? The document delves into how our brains deal with uncertainty, contrasting something called data-driven analysis with conceptually driven
Ooh,
analysis.
that's a good one. Okay, so data-driven, I think I can guess what that is, but conceptually driven, tell me more.
Well, when you have a ton of solid information, you can kind of let the data guide your conclusions, right?
Right.
That's data-driven in a nutshell. But when things are unclear, when there are gaps in our knowledge, those mental models we talked about earlier, they step in to fill in the blanks.
Oh, interesting. So our brains are basically making educated guesses based on what we already believe to be true.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is conceptually driven analysis. Useful, but definitely a recipe for potential bias.
It makes sense, though. If you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, you use your existing knowledge to try and fill in those gaps.
Exactly, which is why, as the document emphasizes, it's crucial to be aware of the limitations of conceptually driven analysis. It's about being humble, knowing we don't have all the answers, and being open to new information that might completely change our perspective.
It's that constant process of learning and refining our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Always open to those plot twists.
Love it. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but does more data always lead to better decisions?
That's a fantastic question. And you know what? The document actually challenges that assumption.
Really? I would have thought more information is always better.
It seems logical. But the research shows that once an experienced analyst has enough information to make a reasonable judgment, getting even more data often doesn't actually improve their accuracy.
That's so interesting. So why doesn't more information always equal a better decision? It seems like it should.
Well, for one, our brains are always filtering information through those pre-existing mental models we've been talking about.
So if we're already leaning towards a particular conclusion, even subconsciously, more data that supports that bias might just make us more confident without actually improving the accuracy of our judgment.
Precisely. And our brains like to keep things simple. They tend to oversimplify complex situations, focusing on a few dominant factors and often ignoring other variables that might be important, especially when we're under pressure to make a quick decision.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We try to make the information fit our simplified understanding of the world, which can lead to some pretty big mistakes.
Exactly. And we see this all the time, even with experts.
Okay, so let's say we recognize the need for more information. How do we know what's valuable and what's just noise? How do we cut through the clutter?
That's where things get really interesting. Remember those 4 types of information we talked about earlier? Additional details about stuff we already know, new information about those same things, completely new variables, and then information that challenges the validity of our whole mental model.
Right, so it's about understanding how each type of information impacts our analysis.
Exactly. It's not just about the amount of information, but the quality and its relevance to what we already understand. And that brings us to the importance of feedback.
Oh, feedback. Always crucial. So, how do we actually learn from our past judgments, especially in the face of uncertainty?
It's tougher than you might think, and our brains don't always learn as effectively as we assume.
We like to think we learn from our mistakes, but it's not always that simple.
It's not. We tend to overestimate the accuracy of our past judgments, especially when those judgments turn out to be correct.
Because it's easy to look back and think, oh, yeah, I totally called that.
Exactly. It's called hindsight bias, and it makes it so hard to learn from our mistakes. Why? Because we're looking at the past through the lens of what we know now.
It's like looking back at a map after a road trip. The route seems so clear, but you forget about all those wrong turns, those detours you had to take along the way.
That's a great analogy. And hindsight bias, it impacts everything, from how we evaluate intelligence reports to how we assess the performance of analysts.
It's human nature to be like, well, obviously, this should have been done differently, but we weren't in the situation.
Precisely. So it's not just about celebrating successes, which is important, but about acknowledging those mistakes and, most importantly, figuring out where we went wrong.
And that takes a certain level of humility.
It does. It's about challenging our own assumptions, admitting when we were wrong, and then using those experiences to make better decisions in the future.
Okay, so far we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how our brains process information, how memory works, those sneaky cognitive biases.
We've all got them.
Now, let's get practical. How can we apply all this to everyday life? The document actually uses a great analogy, medical diagnosis.
Oh, I like that.
So think about how a doctor works. They observe those symptoms, they use their knowledge to generate hypotheses, collect more information to test those hypotheses, and then finally they make a diagnosis.
It's a very structured approach, which is essential to avoid jumping to conclusions or missing something crucial.
And that's where the analysis of competing hypotheses comes back into play. We're generating multiple explanations, looking for evidence to disprove them, and then focusing on the hypothesis that best fits all the available information.
It's a powerful tool for making those informed decisions, even in the face of uncertainty. And you know what? We can all use it. Not just doctors or intelligence analysts.
So true. It's about applying those critical thinking skills to every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. It's a mental discipline. It takes practice, but the payoff is worth it.
Okay, so let's get specific about those analytical strategies. The document highlights the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, which I find fascinating. Let's start with situational logic.
Okay, great. Situational logic, it's super powerful for understanding why people or groups do the things they do, especially when we have a lot of information about the context, the circumstances surrounding those actions.
It's like putting together a puzzle, right? Trying to piece together all the events and circumstances to create a coherent narrative.
Exactly. But like any puzzle, there are always going to be some missing pieces.
And that's where those limitations of situational logic come into play.
Right. It's tough to truly understand the perspectives of others, especially when they come from different cultures, have different values, different life experiences.
We tend to project our own assumptions onto others, assuming everyone sees the world the same way we do, which, let's be honest, is almost never the case.
It's so true, and it can lead to some big misinterpretations, misjudgments.
The example that comes to mind from the document is about South Africa's nuclear weapons program.
Oh, interesting.
A lot of analysts just couldn't believe that South Africa would want nuclear weapons, so they kind of dismissed the evidence because it didn't fit with their worldview.
They were looking at the situation through their own lens instead of trying to understand the logic from South Africa's perspective.
Exactly. And that's a great example of why we need to constantly challenge our assumptions, seek out diverse perspective, and be open to the possibility that we might be totally wrong.
Humility is key in intelligence analysis, just like in life.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so situational logic helps us understand those specific details, but we need other tools to broaden our perspective. And that's where theory comes in, right? Those big picture frameworks help connect the dots.
Yes. Theory gives us those overarching frameworks, those general principles that help us see the forest for the trees.
It's like having a map instead of just a bunch of random landmarks. Theory helps us make sense of the complexity.
Exactly. And the document emphasizes how theory can even help us anticipate what might happen in the future, even when we don't have all the information. It's about using those general principles to make predictions about specific situations.
That's super powerful. But like with anything, there are limitations. Too much reliance on those existing frameworks, and we might miss crucial details that don't fit the pattern.
You've got it. It's about finding that balance between theory and data, the general and the specific. We need both to make those accurate, insightful judgments.
Makes sense. So we've talked about situational logic theory. What about comparison? The document talks about using historical analogies.
Comparisons are incredibly powerful.
They are.
It's about learning from the past, applying those lessons to the challenges we're facing today.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, we have to be cautious. Those comparisons, those historical analogies can be misleading if we don't pay attention to the nuances.
Right, because no two situations are ever exactly alike.
Precisely. We need to ask ourselves, how similar is this situation really? What are the key differences that might change the outcome?
Again, it all comes back to challenging our assumptions. We might be tempted to grab onto an analogy because it fits with our worldview, even if it's not the most accurate comparison.
It's true. We've got to be critical, discerning, and always open to the possibility that our initial assessment might be wrong. And that brings us back to that core principle, actively seeking out those alternative perspectives.
Challenging our assumptions and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong, it's a journey. It's a process of constantly learning and refining our understanding.
Yes. And one of the most powerful triggers for that learning process is encountering surprises. Those events that don't quite fit with our existing understanding of how the world works.
Because one surprise, you can kind of dismiss it. But if you start seeing a pattern of surprises, that's telling you something.
Exactly. It's that light bulb moment, that aha, I've been looking at this all wrong. And those moments, as unsettling as they can be, they're so valuable.
Absolutely.
They're those opportunities to grow, expand our understanding, and make more accurate judgments going forward.
So it's not just about learning from successes, but from those unexpected events that challenge our beliefs. It takes a certain level of humility.
It does.
Yeah.
It's about embracing those challenges to our worldview. That's where real growth happens.
Okay, I love this. Now, the document makes this interesting distinction between strategic assumptions and tactical indicators, which I think is important to unpack.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Because sometimes those terms get used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing at all.
So tell us more about the difference. What are strategic assumptions?
These are those big picture beliefs, those fundamental assumptions we make about, the motivations and capabilities of other actors.
So if we're talking about international relations, it would be those underlying beliefs about why other countries act the way they do.
Exactly. And those assumptions, they form the very foundation of our analysis. They're the lens through which we view events.
They seem pretty important.
They are. But here's the thing. They can be incredibly difficult to change, even when we start to see evidence that contradicts those deeply held beliefs.
We can be pretty stubborn even when presented with facts.
It's true. Our brains don't like to admit we're wrong. So we might cling to those strategic assumptions even tighter. The document actually gives the example of Israeli intelligence before the Yom Kippur War.
Oh, right.
They had this strategic assumption that Arab nations wouldn't attack until they had air superiority, and they stuck with that belief even when all signs pointed to an imminent attack.
That's a tragic example of how those assumptions can blind us to those warning signs, even when they're right there in front of us.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to stay vigilant and be willing to challenge those foundational beliefs.
So we need to be more attentive to those tactical indicators, even when they contradict our big picture assumptions.
Right. It's about being willing to say, okay, what if I'm wrong about this? What if my assumptions are off base? And then adjusting our analysis accordingly.
It's about being open to new information, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Okay, let's get even more specific. We've talked about those general cognitive biases. What are some practical examples of those biases in action, and what can we do to mitigate them?
Okay, good question. Let's talk about vividness bias, for example.
Vividness bias. Okay, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
It's that tendency to give more weight to information that's emotionally impactful or easy for us to imagine.
Yeah.
The things that really grab our attention.
So it's like we're more likely to make decisions based on those dramatic stories, those vivid examples, even if they're not representative of the bigger picture.
Exactly. We're drawn to those stories. They stick in our minds.
Right. And that's where the availability heuristic comes in, which we touched on earlier. We overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall or imagine.
Exactly. And sometimes those available memories, they're not even accurate reflections of reality. They've become distorted over time.
It's wild how much our brains can influence our perception of reality.
They really do. It's why understanding these biases is so important.
So knowing that this vividness bias exists, how do we overcome it?
It's not easy.
Yeah.
They're so ingrained in how our minds work. It's about consciously slowing down our thinking.
Taking a step back.
Yes, looking for data and evidence to support or refute our initial impressions. Don't just go with your gut feeling.
Okay, what about anchoring? We talked about that briefly earlier, but it seems like something worth revisiting.
Anchoring is super powerful. It's that tendency to get stuck on the first piece of information we hear, even if it's totally wrong.
Like that example in the document about estimating the percentage of UN member countries located in Africa.
Oh, right. Even though both groups were given the same information, those who started with a lower anchor, they consistently gave lower estimates. It's like that initial number anchored their thinking.
It's a good reminder that those first impressions, those initial pieces of information, can have a surprisingly strong influence on us, even when we're trying to be objective.
Absolutely. And anchoring can creep into all sorts of decisions, from salary negotiations to how we evaluate investment opportunities.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the challenges of evaluating intelligence analysis after the fact.
Ah, yes. That's where hindsight bias can really become a problem.
Right, hindsight bias. That's where we overestimate how predictable past events were simply because we already know the outcome.
It's like that classic Monday morning quarterbacking. Everyone's a genius after the game is over.
Totally. It's so easy to look back and criticize decisions when we already know how everything turned out. But we need to remember that at the time, things were much less certain.
Absolutely. And hindsight bias can make it incredibly difficult to fairly evaluate intelligence analysis.
Yeah.
We need to be careful in those postmortems.
Like instead of saying, how could they have missed that? Phew, try to put yourself back in their shoes. What information did they have access to at the time?
Right. What were the unknowns? What were the competing priorities? It's about being fair, acknowledging the challenges, and using those experiences to learn and improve. It's almost like our memories are being rewritten to make us look smarter than we actually were.
Right. And if we're not careful, we can end up with this inflated sense of our own abilities. Makes us less likely to question what we think we know.
That's why recognizing those biases and actively working to mitigate them is so crucial.
Easier said than done, though, right? The document makes it clear that these biases are deeply ingrained. Even when we're aware of them, it's still a struggle. So what can we do?
It takes effort, consistent effort. Think of it like building a muscle. It's about developing those mental habits, those disciplined ways of thinking that help us counteract those natural tendencies.
So we need those practical strategies, those concrete tools to help us stay on track.
That's what this document is all about. And it's not just for individuals. Creating a culture that values those critical thinking skills is crucial for any organization.
Right. So it's about more than just think critically. We need to create an environment that actually supports that kind of thinking.
Exactly. A culture that values critical thinking, open debate, welcomes those diverse perspectives, where people feel comfortable challenging assumptions, even those long-held beliefs.
So it's about moving away from that groupthink mentality.
Yes. Where everyone just nods along with the boss or the prevailing narrative, that doesn't lead to good analysis.
Not at all.
Yeah.
What are some practical things leaders can do to encourage this, to build that culture of critical thinking?
There are some great strategies. Things like red teaming, for example, where you designate a team to challenge the assumptions of the main analytical group.
I like that. Play devil's advocate, get people thinking differently.
Exactly. And structured analytical techniques like the analysis of competing hypotheses,
Mhm.
which we've talked about. That's a great one for encouraging rigorous, objective analysis.
And of course, training and professional development are essential.
100%. We can't just tell people to think critically and expect them to know what that means. We've got to equip them with those tools and techniques to do it well.
So those training programs, they shouldn't just focus on the technical aspects of, analyzing intelligence.
Right, there's that human element.
They need to include those psychological elements as well, those cognitive biases, the role of emotion in our judgments, understanding those mental models.
Being aware of our own thinking processes.
Exactly. Training is key, but it doesn't stop there, right? The document also highlights the importance of organizational structure. How can we structure intelligence organizations to actually support high-quality analysis?
It's about creating an environment where those critical thinking skills can actually flourish. And a big part of that is ensuring analysts have access to a wide range of information.
And not just from within their own little silo.
Right. We need to be breaking down those silos.
Get different perspectives in there.
Exactly. Because intelligence analysis, it's not a solo sport. Bringing those diverse perspectives to the table, challenging those assumptions, that's how you get closer to a more complete picture.
So it's about creating those collaborative environments, cross-functional teams where people from different backgrounds can share their expertise.
It's amazing what can happen when you bring those different minds together. And those feedback loops.
Ah, yes. Feedback. Always crucial.
It's not enough to just produce the analysis. We need those mechanisms in place to evaluate how those judgments actually played out in the real world.
So, did those predictions turn out to be accurate? Where did we go wrong? What can we learn from those experiences?
Exactly. Those after-action reports, those debriefs, they're not about assigning blame. It's about creating that culture of continuous learning.
And ensuring that analysts have adequate time to actually do that critical thinking.
That's so important. In those high-pressure environments, it's easy to get caught up in just reacting, putting out those daily fires.
Totally.
But for high-quality analysis, we need to protect that space, that time for analysts to step back, think deeply, explore those alternatives.
Because otherwise, you end up with rushed judgments, missed opportunities.
Exactly. And having a clear, well-defined analytical process in place can help with that too.
So, a set of guidelines, procedures to ensure consistency and rigor in the analysis.
Right. No matter who's doing the analysis, no matter the issue, you have a framework to follow.
Sure.
And the document highlights a really valuable one, the analysis of competing hypotheses.
We've talked about that a bit already, but it seems like it's worth exploring in more detail.
It's that important. This 8-step process provides a structured way to generate those multiple hypotheses, test them against the evidence, and identify the most likely explanation.
And it helps us overcome those biases.
Yes, it forces us to consider alternatives, even those we might not initially like.
I'm seeing a theme here. So we structure the problem, challenge our assumptions, consider alternative explanations. What about communicating those judgments effectively to decision makers?
Ah, that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Hmm.
All that brilliant analysis isn't much good if it's not communicated clearly.
So no jargon, right? Clear, concise language that avoids ambiguity.
Exactly. And tailoring those judgments to the audience.
Mhm.
You need to know what information they need to make the decision, what's useful for them.
It's like a policymaker doesn't need every little detail of the analysis. They need the key takeaway.
And a level of confidence.
Right. How certain are we about these conclusions? What are the potential pitfalls?
Exactly. It's about transparency, acknowledging those limitations, those uncertainties.
Because the world is messy.
It is.
Yeah.
And we never have all the answers. So being upfront about those limitations builds trust.
Right, because ultimately those policymakers, they're the ones who have to make those tough calls. They need all the information, good and bad.
They need that range of possibilities, not just the most likely outcome, but those what-if scenarios, those contingencies.
And those indicators, right, those signs they should watch out for that might suggest a course correction is needed.
Exactly. We need to give them that actionable intelligence, the information they need to adapt and respond effectively.
Okay, one last question before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. How do you think we can foster more creativity and innovation in intelligence analysis? Because it seems like we need to break free from those assumptions, those traditional ways of thinking.
It's a great question, because intelligence analysis, it's not just about following procedures. It's about those aha moments.
Breakthroughs.
Right. And to get there, we need to create an environment where those creative sparks can fly, where analysts feel empowered to think differently, even if it goes against conventional wisdom.
So encouraging that intellectual curiosity, challenging the status quo.
Yes. It's about celebrating those what-if questions. The document actually highlights specific techniques that could be super helpful. Things like brainstorming, lateral thinking.
Oh, I love brainstorming. Getting all those ideas out there, no matter how crazy they might seem.
It's a great way to get those creative juices flowing. And, the document emphasizes that especially in those early stages of brainstorming, quantity is more important than quality.
Oh, interesting. So no judgment, no criticism, just get those ideas flowing.
That's it. Because sometimes the most out there ideas, those are the seeds of real innovation.
It seems like that ties back to creating that culture of psychological safety we talked about earlier.
It does. Where people feel safe to take risks, to propose those unconventional solutions, and where they know that even if an idea doesn't work out, it's a learning opportunity, not a failure.
And those creative pursuits take time, right?
They do. It's so easy to get caught in that reactive mode, especially in fast-paced environments.
Just constantly putting out fires, never having time for that deep thinking, that exploration.
Exactly. Leaders need to recognize the value of that creative time and protect it.
So maybe create those dedicated innovation teams, those skunkworks projects.
Exactly. Give those teams the freedom to experiment, to push those boundaries.
And to fail. Because you learn so much more from those failures than from always playing it safe.
Absolutely. And when those innovative ideas do emerge, we need to celebrate them, recognize and reward the people who are thinking differently and coming up with those creative solutions.
Because that's what drives progress. So we've talked about those big picture cultural shifts, those leadership strategies. But what about those practical tools and techniques that analysts can use day to day? Those things that can help improve their thinking, help them overcome those biases, and produce more accurate judgments.
There are so many great ones, and honestly, a lot of them are things we can all use in our own lives.
Right. It's not just about intelligence analysis. It's about becoming better thinkers, more effective decision makers.
Absolutely. And one of the key takeaways from the document is the importance of structuring those analytical problems.
Okay, structuring. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think about it like this. You've got a problem, maybe it's a big complex issue you're grappling with.
Right.
Structuring is about imposing order on that chaos. It's about using those tools and techniques to organize your thoughts, to see those relationships more clearly.
And the document breaks down this structuring process into two main components: decomposition and externalization.
You got it. So decomposition, that's about breaking down those complex problems into smaller, more manageable parts.
Kind of like reverse engineering.
Yes, exactly. It's about taking that big, overwhelming thing and making it less intimidating by breaking it down into those bite-sized pieces.
Okay, so we decompose the problem, then we externalize.
Precisely. And externalization, that's about getting those thoughts out of our heads and into the world.
Because, let's be honest, our brains can only hold so much information at once.
It's true. We have limited working memory, so we write those thoughts down.
Make those lists, diagrams, charts.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Whatever helps to visualize those thoughts, to see those connections more clearly. The document uses the example of a simple math problem, like trying to multiply 46 by 78 in your head.
Ouch, that hurts my brain just thinking about it.
Right. But if you write it down, break it into steps, much easier. And that's what we're doing with externalization. We're offloading some of that cognitive work onto those external aids.
So we're basically giving our brains a break. And there are a lot of different ways to externalize.
There are. You can create a mind map.
Right. Or a
So-
flow chart to visualize those different steps.
Yes. Or a matrix. The document gives the example of that car purchase matrix, which is a great one.
Oh, I remember that. I'm going to have to try that next time I'm making a big decision.
It's such a useful tool. So the key takeaway here is that structuring, it's not just for intelligence analysts, it's something we can all use in our daily lives to make those tough decisions.
I love that. It's about being intentional, being systematic in our thinking. Don't just let those thoughts bounce around in our heads.
And the analysis of competing hypotheses that we discussed earlier, that's a great example of structuring in action.
Right? That's where you create that matrix, listing the hypotheses and the evidence for and against each one.
It forces you to consider those alternative explanations, even the ones that don't initially seem very likely.
It's such a valuable tool for overcoming those biases, challenging our assumptions, and ultimately making more informed decisions.
Precisely. And again, it's something we can all benefit from, whether you're an intelligence analyst or just trying to navigate the complexities of daily life.
It's amazing how much of what we've been talking about applies to everyday life. This isn't just about, global events or high-stakes intelligence. It's about how we make decisions, big or small.
Absolutely. Those mental models, those biases, they influence everything we do, from how we choose a partner to how we invest our money.
It's true. I'm definitely starting to see some of my own biases pop up in a whole new light after reading this document.
It's eye-opening, isn't it? Once you start seeing those patterns in your own thinking, it's hard to unsee them.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the mental side of analysis, those cognitive processes, those biases. But this document also delves into some really practical strategies for structuring a problem, how to actually organize our thoughts so we don't get lost in the weeds.
It's all about working with the limitations of our brains, recognizing that we're not wired to juggle a million things at once.
That's true. Our brains are amazing, but they have their limits.
They do. And one of the key strategies the document highlights is this idea of decomposition and externalization.
Okay. Decomposition and externalization. Those sound a little intimidating. Break it down for us. What do those terms actually mean?
Think of it like this. You have a problem, right? Maybe it's a big decision you need to make, a complex situation you're trying to understand.
Right.
Decomposition is about taking that big, overwhelming thing and breaking it down into smaller, more manageable parts.
So kind of like a reverse engineering a process. Instead of looking at the finished product, you're breaking it down into all the individual components.
Exactly, you've got it. It's about making that complex thing less intimidating by breaking it down into those bite-sized pieces.
Okay, so you decompose the problem, break it down into smaller parts. Then what's externalization?
So once you've broken it down, you need a way to actually work with those pieces.
Yes.
Right? And that's where externalization comes in. It's about getting those thoughts out of your head and into the world.
Because it's so easy to get stuck in our own heads. Those thoughts just keep swirling around and around.
They do. Our working memory, it can only hold so much at once. So we need to offload some of that cognitive work onto external aids.
So we write those thoughts down, make lists, draw diagrams, create those spreadsheets.
Exactly. Whatever works for you. It's about finding a visual representation that helps you see those connections more clearly.
It's like creating a roadmap for your thoughts.
I like that. And the document gives the example of a simple math problem, like trying to multiply 46 by 78 in your head.
Ouch. Yeah, that's painful.
Right. Our brains just aren't wired for that. But if you write it down, break it down into steps, suddenly it becomes much more manageable.
It's like you're offloading some of that mental effort onto the paper.
Exactly. And there's so many different ways to externalize. You mentioned lists, diagram,
Right, and there are those mind maps, flow charts, even that car purchase matrix we talked about earlier.
all great examples.
Hmm.
The key is to find what works for you. Experiment. Try different approaches and see what helps you to organize those thoughts most effectively.
So the main takeaway here is that this idea of structuring, it's not just for intelligence analysts, it's something we can all use in our daily lives.
Absolutely. It's a life skill. Whether you're grappling with a big decision or just trying to get a handle on your to-do list, decomposition and externalization can help.
It's about being more deliberate, more systematic in our thinking. Okay, and this seems like a perfect place to bring back the analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH.
You're right. The ACH is a great example of structuring in action.
Right, it's where you create that matrix. You list out all those possible hypotheses, and then you systematically evaluate the evidence for and against each one.
And it's important to remember, the goal isn't to confirm the hypothesis you like best.
It's to disprove them, or at least to try to.
Exactly. We have to actively look for those contradictions, those pieces of evidence that don't fit with our preferred narrative. It's tough, but that's how we get closer to the truth.
We need to be willing to change our minds when the evidence demands it. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about cognitive biases, mental models, analytical strategies, the importance of feedback and structured thinking. It's been an amazing journey.
It has. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
The biggest takeaway for me is how important it is to be aware of our own thinking processes. Those biases are always there, lurking beneath the surface, influencing our judgments. So true. And it's not about eliminating those biases entirely. That's probably impossible. It's about recognizing them, understanding how they work, and then using these strategies and techniques to mitigate their influence.
We've got to stay vigilant, stay curious, and stay humble.
Yes. Because the world is complex. The more we learn about those cognitive processes, the better equipped we'll be to navigate that complexity and to make sound judgments.
That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the intelligence analyst's mind. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.